You ever feel like the Haunted Mansion is more than just a ride? Like there's something about it that lingers? That thought crossed my mind the night my friends and I decided to sneak in after hours. It started as a dare, a joke, really, something to brag about later. But by the end of the night, we weren't laughing. It was supposed to be simple. Disneyland was closed, the park nearly silent except for the occasional maintenance crew making their rounds. My friends, Megan, Tyler, and Jake, and I had timed everything perfectly. Jake, who worked a summer gig as a cast member, knew the schedules and the back routes. He said it would be easy. We slipped through the employee-only door by the service area and entered the Haunted Mansion. The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. By day, the mansion was charming, with its cobwebs, dusty chandeliers, and ghostly illusions. But at night, with no tourists or cheerful background music, it felt wrong. The dim emergency lights barely illuminated the dusty wallpaper, the cracked mirrors, the looming portraits of long-dead faces. It wasn't whimsical anymore. It felt real. "I can't believe we're doing this," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "Relax," Jake said, grinning. "It's just a ride." But even he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. We made our way past the familiar scenes, the stretching room, the endless hallway, the floating candelabra. It was eerie seeing it all so still, so quiet. The animatronics, frozen in place, felt less like harmless props and more like lifeless bodies. When we reached the seance room, Jake stopped. "This is it," he said, pointing to the far wall. "What's it?" I asked, already regretting coming along. He grinned. "A hidden room. I overheard some of the maintenance guys talking about it, said it was part of the original ride design, but they sealed it off years ago. Nobody goes in there anymore." I looked where he was pointing. It didn't look like much, just a section of wall behind Madame Leota's floating crystal ball. But as Jake approached, he pressed against the panel, and with a faint click, the wall slid open. Behind it was a narrow, dark hallway. This doesn't feel right," Megan said, backing away. Tyler laughed nervously. "What, scared of a secret room? Come on, this is what we came for." I wasn't so sure anymore, but curiosity got the better of me. Jake led the way, and we followed him into the darkness. The hallway was narrow, lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and lit by a single flickering bulb. It felt endless, stretching farther than it should have. And then we found it. The hidden room. It was a Victorian parlor, untouched by time. Dusty antique furniture filled the space. Ornate chairs with clawed feet, a grand piano, a mahogany desk covered in yellowed papers. A massive, moth-eaten rug stretched across the wooden floor. But it was the portraits that caught my attention. They lined the walls, each one more unsettling than the last. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary 19th century paintings. Men in suits, women in flowing dresses. But their eyes were too lifelike, too knowing. And no matter where I moved, their gazes followed me. Megan shuddered. "This isn't part of the ride." "No kidding," Tyler said, his voice cracking. Jake walked to the desk, running his hand over the papers. "It's like they just left everything here." As he spoke, the lights flickered. For a split second, the room changed. The walls darkened, the furniture warped, and the portraits, the faces in the paintings were gone, replaced by blank, staring canvases. And then the light returned, and everything was normal again. "Did you see that?" Megan whispered, clutching my arm. "Yeah," I said, my mouth dry. "We need to leave." Jake, of course, ignored us. He was too busy poking around the room, oblivious to the growing sense of dread. And then the piano played a single note. We all froze. The keys had moved, slowly, deliberately. "Okay, that's enough," Megan said, backing toward the door. "We're leaving." She reached for the hallway, but the doorway was gone. Where there had been an open passage was now a solid wall. "What the hell?" Tyler said, running his hands over the wallpaper. "This was the way out." Jake's confidence wavered. It's a trick, right? A special effect?" But it wasn't. The air grew colder, and the room felt smaller, like it was closing in on us. And then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible, a chorus of voices murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. But they grew louder, sharper, until I could make out the words. "Why are you here? You don't belong. Stay with us." The portraits began to change. The faces stretched and twisted, their eyes widening in terror. Some of them started smiling, horrible, crooked smiles. And then I saw it. One of the paintings now showed us. The four of us standing in that very room, our faces pale and distorted. "Oh my God," Megan sobbed. "What is happening?" The lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness. When they came back on, the furniture had moved. The grand piano was now inches away from us, its keys pressed down as though an unseen hand was playing it. The desk chair was turned facing us, though no one sat in it. And then the rug began to move. It writhed, bulging upward as though something was underneath it. Slowly, it began to peel back, revealing a dark, gaping hole in the floor. From the hole came a sound, a wet, dragging noise, like something was crawling its way toward us. "We need to go," I shouted, grabbing Megan's hand. We ran to the wall where the door had been, pounding and scratching at it, desperate to escape. But the whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. And then the room began to shift. The walls stretched, the furniture melted into the floor, and the portraits disappeared, replaced by windows that showed nothing, just an endless void of swirling blackness. "Why won't it stop?" Tyler screamed. Jake fell to his knees, clutching his head. "It's in my head! It's in my head!" And then he was gone. 1 second he was there, and the next the floor beneath him gave way, and he disappeared into the void. We were trapped in a nightmare, the room twisting and turning, the whispers growing louder, more chaotic. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We were back in the seance room. The hidden door was gone. The ride was silent. Still, Jake was gone. Security found us wandering the park hours later, incoherent and shaking. We tried to explain, but they didn't believe us. They said there was no hidden room, no missing cast member. But I know what we saw. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. They're waiting. Disneyland's It's a Small World is supposed to be a happy ride, a celebration of culture, music, and unity. It's the kind of attraction where you relax and enjoy the nostalgia, a staple of any visit to the park. But for the Thompson family, their ride wasn't happy. It became something much darker, something no one wants to talk about. It was a warm, sunny afternoon when Mark, his wife, Susan, and their 2 children, Emily and Jacob, decided to ride It's a Small World. The line was short, the air was buzzing with the chatter of other guests, and the repetitive melody of the iconic song spilled out from the attraction, cheerful and inviting. The Thompsons boarded their boat and settled in, ready for a relaxing, whimsical experience. The ride started as expected. The familiar scenes of colorful animatronic dolls and glittering backdrops showcasing children from around the world. Each scene transitioned seamlessly into the next, Europe, Asia, Africa, all accompanied by the incessant yet oddly comforting song. "Mom, look, that one's winking!" Emily pointed to a Dutch doll spinning on a windmill. "It's just the animatronics," Susan said with a smile. But even she couldn't deny that the doll's movements seemed off. Their heads turned too slowly, their eyes seemed to linger on the family's boat, and their painted smiles looked unusually sharp under the ride's dim lighting. As they approached the final room, the one where all the children join in harmony under a dazzling array of white and gold lights, the boat jerked suddenly, almost violently, and veered left. The family exchanged confused glances as their boat glided into a darkened tunnel off to the side, a path none of them had noticed before. "Is this a new section?" Mark asked, gripping the side of the boat. "I don't think so," Susan replied, her voice tinged with unease. The cheerful music faded into silence. The tunnel ahead was dimly lit, the soft glow of the ride's usual lights replaced by flickering lanterns mounted on walls of decayed wood. The air grew damp, carrying the distinct smell of mildew and something metallic, something like rust or blood. "Mom, I don't like this," Jacob whispered, clutching his mother's arm. "It's okay," Susan said, her voice wavering. "It's probably just part of the ride." But it didn't feel like part of the ride. It felt like something they weren't meant to see. The tunnel opened into a large, shadowy chamber. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting an eerie, shifting light across the water. The walls were lined with what looked like forgotten props, old puppets, rusting gears, and dusty mannequins. But these weren't the friendly, colorful figures from the rest of the ride. These dolls were different. They were pale, their glassy eyes too lifelike, their faces contorted into unsettling expressions of fear or pain. Some were slumped over in the corners, their arms twisted at unnatural angles. Others stood upright, staring directly at the family as their boat drifted past. "Why do they look like that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Mark said, scanning the room for any sign of an exit. Just stay calm." The boat moved deeper into the chamber, passing grotesque scenes that grew more horrifying with each turn. In one corner, a group of dolls was gathered around a miniature fire, their hands held up as if trying to warm themselves, their faces frozen in anguish. In another, a child-sized figure lay sprawled on a makeshift operating table, its torso cracked open to reveal a mess of wires and gears that oozed a dark, viscous liquid. The family couldn't look away, their eyes darting from one nightmare to the next. The whispers began then, soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably real. They seemed to come from everywhere, bouncing off the walls and rippling through the water. "Who's there?" Mark shouted into the darkness, his voice echoing back to him. The whispers didn't answer. Instead, the boat lurched again, nearly tossing Emily overboard as it picked up speed. The family clung to the sides, their knuckles white as they were pulled further into the unknown. The next scene was worse. The walls of the tunnel were lined with dozens of tiny figures, all staring down at the boat. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow sockets that seemed to follow the family's every move. Some of the dolls appeared to be crying. Tears of a dark, oily substance streaked their porcelain cheeks. Others had mouths frozen mid-scream, their tiny hands pressed against the glass as if trying to escape. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, droning hum that vibrated through the air. The sound seemed to come from the water itself, which had turned murky and thick. A strange, metallic taste filled the air, making it hard to breathe. "What is this place?" Susan said, her voice barely audible over the noise. Mark didn't answer. He was too busy watching the walls, where shadows flickered and danced just out of reach. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw one move, quickly, deliberately. A figure, tall and skeletal, darted between the lanterns, its elongated arms brushing against the walls as it watched the family. "It's following us," Mark whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. The boat slowed as it entered another chamber. This one was smaller, more claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to close in around them. The only light came from a single flickering lantern hanging above a dilapidated stage. On the stage stood 4 dolls, eerily lifelike, their features unmistakable. "Oh my God," Susan said, covering her mouth. The dolls were dressed in miniature versions of the family's clothes. One had Mark's plaid shirt, another wore Emily's pink dress. Their faces were detailed down to the smallest freckle, their eyes wide and unblinking. "It's us," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "They're us." The whispers swelled into a cacophony, a chorus of overlapping voices that seemed to chant something just beyond comprehension. The water began to churn, the boat rocking violently as the shadows on the walls grew darker, larger, closer. "We have to get out of here." Mark shouted, gripping the sides of the boat as it spun in circles, caught in the chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The water stilled, the whispers fell silent, and the boat glided forward into the familiar finale of It's a Small World. The cheerful music returned, the bright colors and smiling dolls a jarring contrast to what they had just witnessed. The Thompsons sat in stunned silence as the boat reached the unloading area. A cast member greeted them with the usual practiced smile. "Welcome back. Did you enjoy the ride?" Mark stumbled off the boat, his legs shaking. There was something wrong. A tunnel and the dolls, "I'm sorry, sir." The cast member interrupted, her smile faltering. "There's no tunnel in the ride. Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" Before Mark could argue, Susan grabbed his arm. "Mark, look." She held up a small, damp handkerchief. It smelled of salt water and decay. Their clothes, too, were wet, stained with a dark substance that reeked of rust and mildew. The cast member's smile vanished. "Please wait here," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "I need to get my supervisor." As they waited, Mark's eyes wandered to the final room of the ride. Among the sea of singing dolls, 4 new figures stood together. Their faces were eerily familiar, their eyes wide and lifeless. It was them. Weeks later, Disney staff would discover the Thompsons' belongings scattered throughout the ride. Susan's purse, Emily's hair clip, Mark's watch, but the family was never seen again. And the dolls? They still stand there, smiling, singing, watching. You ever ride Disneyland's Alice in Wonderland and think, just for a second, that the ride is a little off? It's colorful and whimsical, sure, but there's something about the way the characters move, the way the Cheshire Cat grins, that's always felt a little too strange. I never thought much about it until the night I rode it alone. That night changed everything. It was near park closing, and the lines had finally thinned out. My friends had gone to grab snacks, so I decided to ride Alice in Wonderland by myself. Why not? It's a short ride, fun, nostalgic. I hopped into the little Caterpillar car, settled in, and waved to the cast member who kept me off with the usual cheerful, "Enjoy your ride." The car jerked forward, and I was off. The first part of the ride was exactly as I remembered. Vibrant, surreal, and a little chaotic. The spinning flowers, the white rabbit panicking about the time, Alice chasing after him. It was all there, all perfectly normal. I even laughed to myself when the doors opened and the ride ascended to the upper level, where you weave through Wonderland's wacky, disjointed scenes. But as the car turned a corner and entered the spinning tunnel sequence, something felt wrong. The tunnel was disorienting, as always. Walls painted with swirling patterns of blues and purples, spinning lights creating the illusion that the car was tilting. Normally, you pass through in a matter of seconds and then you're in the next scene, but this time, the car didn't move on. The spinning slowed, the lights dimmed, and the music, usually an upbeat, chaotic medley, warped into something slower, darker. The car crept forward, but no matter how far I went, the tunnel stretched endlessly ahead. At first, I thought it was just a malfunction. Rides break down all the time. But then I noticed the lights. They weren't just dimming, they were going out, one by one, leaving patches of darkness in their wake. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing eerily in the confined space. There was no response. And then I heard it. A low, rumbling chuckle, soft at first but growing louder, surrounding me. Wandered a bit too far, haven't you? The voice was unmistakable. Smooth, teasing, and layered with a hint of menace. The Cheshire Cat. I froze, gripping the sides of the car as my heart pounded. The tunnel lights flickered, and there he was, his grinning face glowing faintly in the dark, suspended in the air like he'd stepped out of the ride and into reality. "You don't belong here," he purred, his grin stretching wider. "But no matter, we'll fix that." "Okay, very funny," I said, trying to convince myself this was some elaborate prank. "You can stop now." The cat's eyes narrowed, glowing brighter. "Oh, but you haven't reached the end yet. Don't you want to see where the rabbit hole leads?" The car suddenly jolted forward, faster now, the tunnel spinning wildly around me. My stomach churned as the lights flared and dimmed in rapid succession, the swirling patterns blurring together into something nauseating. When the car finally stopped, I wasn't in the next scene of the ride. I was in a hallway. It was long and narrow, lined with doors of all shapes and sizes. Some were brightly painted, others cracked and splintered, their handles rusted. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled damp like an old basement. The Cheshire Cat's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "Pick a door. Any door. But do choose wisely. Some lead to Wonderland, and some," he chuckled darkly, "don't." My hands trembled as I scanned the doors, each one more foreboding than the last. The car wasn't moving anymore. It was as if the ride was daring me to get out. "No," I whispered to myself. "This isn't real. It's just a ride." The cat's laughter returned, louder this time. "A ride? Oh, you poor silly thing. You've fallen much deeper than that." One of the doors creaked open on its own, revealing darkness so absolute it felt alive. A cold breeze rushed out, carrying faint whispers and the distant sound of something dripping. The car suddenly lurched forward, forcing me toward the open door. I pressed myself back, trying to resist, but the car wouldn't stop. It rolled closer, inch by inch, the darkness inside the door growing, reaching out like tendrils. And then I saw them. Hands. Thin, skeletal hands clawing at the edges of the doorway, dragging themselves out. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I realized they weren't just whispers, they were voices. Pleading. Crying. "Turn back. Don't let them take you. Run." I screamed and clutched the sides of the car as it veered sharply, jerking me away from the door at the last second. The hallway blurred around me, the doors slamming shut one by one as the car sped through. When the car finally stopped, I was in another scene, or what was left of it. It looked like part of the ride, the Queen of Hearts garden, with the playing cards painting the roses red. But the colors were muted, the figures frozen. The Queen's animatronic stood motionless, her face twisted into an unnatural snarl, her paint chipped and peeling. The roses dripped with thick, dark liquid. Not paint, but something darker, something that smelled like iron. I glanced up, and there he was again, the Cheshire Cat. He was larger now, his grin taking up half his face, his eyes gleaming like twin lanterns. "Off with your head," he whispered, the words slithering through the air like smoke. The Queen's animatronic jerked to life, her arm swinging down with a rusted axe. I screamed and ducked as the blade whistled past me, narrowly missing the car. The ride's track jolted violently, the car lurching forward into darkness once again. I don't know how long I was in that endless nightmare. The scenes blurred together, doors that led nowhere, animatronics that moved on their own, voices whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. At one point, I looked down at my hands and realized they were wet. Dark streaks covered my fingers, sticky and metallic. I didn't want to think about what it was. The Cheshire Cat was everywhere, his grin glowing in the dark, his voice taunting me. "You should have stayed with the others," he hissed. "Now you'll never leave." When the car finally emerged into the daylight, I was shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The ride's exit was in sight, the cheerful music playing as if nothing had happened. The cast member smiled as I stumbled out. "Enjoy your ride?" she asked. I couldn't speak. When I met back up with my friends, they looked worried. "Where have you been?" one of them asked. "We've been looking for you for hours." "Hours?" I repeated, confused. "It was just one ride." They shook their heads. "It's been 3 hours. Your phone's been off this whole time." I pulled my phone from my pocket and my blood ran cold. The screen was on but distorted. A single image was burned into the display. The Cheshire Cat's grin, wide and mocking, his glowing eyes staring back at me. I'll never ride that attraction again. I still hear his voice sometimes, late at night. "You've wandered too far." You know how Disneyland is supposed to be the happiest place on Earth? A perfect bubble of safety and magic? That's what I thought too, until that night. It was late, just before the park was about to close. My girlfriend Olivia and I had been wandering, trying to squeeze in one last ride. The park was almost empty. The fireworks were done and the streets glowed with that soft golden light that feels like a dream. We were heading toward Adventureland, hoping to ride Jungle Cruise one last time when Olivia stopped. "What's that?" she said, pointing to a narrow, shadowy path just beyond a row of potted plants. I followed her gaze. It was tucked away so well I almost didn't see it. An unmarked trail hidden between some shrubs. There were no signs, no ropes blocking it off. Nothing to indicate it was off limits. Just a dark, quiet path leading somewhere unseen. "I've never noticed that before," I said, already feeling uneasy. "Me neither," Olivia replied, stepping closer. "We're not supposed to go back there," I said, but she gave me that grin, the one that always made me do things I probably shouldn't. "Come on," she teased. "It's probably just a shortcut or something. Let's check it out." I hesitated. There was something wrong about it. The air felt heavier here, colder, like the rest of the park's magic didn't extend to this spot. But Olivia was already walking ahead, so I followed. The path twisted and turned, overgrown and oddly dark. The warm glow of Disneyland faded with every step, replaced by an eerie dimness that seemed to press against us. "Doesn't this feel weird to you?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly. Olivia shrugged, but her smile had faded. "Yeah. It's like the air feels heavier, doesn't it?" I nodded. The faint hum of the park, the music, the chatter, the rides was gone. All we could hear was the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. After what felt like forever, the path opened into a clearing, and that's when we saw it. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was an entire section of the park, a forgotten land. Dilapidated rides loomed in the darkness, their bright colors faded into muted, sickly hues. A broken carousel sat in the center, its horses chipped and mangled, some missing their heads. A Ferris wheel stood off to the side, like its rusted frame groaning softly in the wind, and scattered around the area were animatronics, lifeless, frozen figures of cartoonish animals and people. Their painted smiles were cracked and peeling, and their empty eyes seemed to follow us. "What the hell is this?" Olivia whispered. I didn't answer. My attention was on the sign hanging above an arched entrance. "Welcome to Dreamland." Dreamland, I'd never heard of it. It wasn't on any map, any brochure, or any online guide. And yet, it was here. As we stepped further in, a sound broke the silence. Music. It was faint at first, like a distant memory of the cheerful Disney melodies that play throughout the park. But something was wrong with it. The notes were distorted, dragging unnaturally, as if the record was warped. "Do you hear that?" Olivia asked. I nodded, my stomach churning. The music seemed to be coming from the carousel. Olivia moved toward it, her footsteps hesitant but curious. I wanted to tell her to stop, to turn back, but my throat felt tight. Something about this place made it impossible to think clearly. The carousel was worse up close. The horses were twisted and broken, their painted eyes wide with terror. Some were missing legs, others were covered in strange, dark stains. The entire structure seemed to sag under its own weight, yet the faint music continued to play. "Ethan," Olivia whispered, pointing. I followed her gaze and froze. The carousel wasn't still. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the platform was rotating, creaking with each turn. The horses seemed to shift, their mangled bodies twisting in the dim light. "That's not possible," I stammered. "There's no one here," Olivia said, her voice shaking. And then, as if on cue, the carousel lights flickered on. The harsh, buzzing glow revealed something else. Shadows. At first, I thought they were just tricks of the light, cast by the broken rides and animatronics. But they moved. I grabbed Olivia's arm. "We need to go. Now." She didn't argue. As we turned back toward the path, the music grew louder, faster, more distorted. It was no longer the cheerful tune it once was. It had turned into a chaotic symphony of warped notes and dissonant chords. And then the laughter started. High-pitched, childlike giggles echoed through the air, but they weren't playful. They were hollow, cold, and mocking. I glanced back and saw them. The shadows. They were no longer just shapes, they had form. Humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky, like broken marionettes. They darted between the rides, growing closer with every second. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Olivia's hand. We sprinted toward the path, but it felt longer now, like it was stretching out ahead of us. The air grew colder, heavier, and the warped music followed us, blending with the sound of creaking metal and those horrible, hollow laughs. I could hear them behind us, the shadows. Their footsteps didn't sound human. They scraped and dragged like claws on asphalt. Olivia tripped, hitting the ground hard. "Get up!" I shouted, pulling her to her feet. But before we could move, something stepped into the path ahead of us. It was an animatronic, or at least it used to be. Its body was rusted and bent, its face frozen in a grotesque smile. Its eyes were gone, leaving empty sockets that seemed to stare straight through us. And then it moved. Its head tilted to the side with a sickening creak, and its jaw opened, emitting a static-filled voice. "Stay with us." I don't remember how we got out. One moment we were running, the next we were standing in front of park security, trembling and out of breath. They said we'd been missing for 3 days. 3 days. It felt like hours. They found us near the entrance, rambling incoherently. Olivia wouldn't stop crying, and I couldn't stop hearing that music. The warped, twisted melody that still haunts me. I told them about Dreamland, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. They said there was no such place, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear the music. Somewhere in the shadows of Disneyland, Dreamland is waiting, and it doesn't let go. You know how Pirates of the Caribbean is supposed to be fun? It's one of those rides you can always count on for a dose of nostalgia, with its catchy music, mischievous pirates, and hints of spooky adventure. That's all I expected when my friends and I decided to ride it one late evening. We were laughing, joking, and winding down after a long day at the park. None of us could have imagined the nightmare we were about to step into. It all started like any other ride. The line was short since the park was near closing, and the four of us, Lisa, Derek, Kayla, and me, were excited for one last trip through the classic attraction. The familiar damp air hit us as we stepped inside. That smell, a mix of chlorine and machinery, always took me back to being a kid. The dim lighting, the faint sounds of cannon fire and pirate songs, it was all so comforting, like slipping into a well-worn memory. We boarded the boat, settling into our seats as it glided forward. Everything felt normal. The ride began as it always did, taking us past the eerie mist with Davy Jones' face swirling in it, his voice booming about curses and pirate lore. We passed the skeleton helmsman steering a ghostly ship, the skeletal pirates lounging in a treasure-filled grotto. Then we reached the ship battle scene, where the pirate ship is firing its cannons at the town. It's one of the most iconic moments of the ride. Loud, colorful, and chaotic, except this time it wasn't. The boat slowed to a halt. At first, none of us thought much of it. The ride often pauses briefly to let other boats get back on schedule. But the usual sounds of cannon fire and shouting pirates faded into silence. The animatronics froze mid-motion, the lights dimmed, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. "What's going on?" Lisa asked, her voice breaking the silence. "Probably just a glitch," Derek said, though he didn't sound convinced. We waited, but the longer we sat there, the more the silence pressed in. Then, without warning, the boat jolted violently. The water sloshed around us, and the boat began moving, not forward, but sideways. It felt as though the track had shifted beneath us, pulling us toward a dark, narrow tunnel on the far side of the scene. "That's not part of the ride," Kayla whispered, gripping the edge of the boat. I turned to look at the cast member station, but it was empty. There was no one there to stop us, no one to call for help. We were on our own. The boat slipped into the tunnel, leaving the familiar scenes behind. Darkness swallowed us, and the cheerful glow of the ride disappeared entirely. The air grew colder, carrying a foul stench that hit us like a wave. It wasn't the usual damp, musty smell of the attraction. This was different, thick, acrid, and rotten like decayed fish and stagnant water. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the boat, but even that seemed off. The splashes were slower, heavier, as though the water wasn't water at all, but something thicker. The tunnel opened into a new scene, dimly lit by flickering lanterns. At first, it looked like a continuation of the pirate theme, stone walls, wooden barrels, and tattered flags, but the details were wrong. The first thing I noticed was the animatronics. These weren't the playful, mischievous pirates from the rest of the ride. These pirates were cruel. One figure stood holding a rusted blade, frozen mid-swing over a bound prisoner. The prisoner's face was twisted in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. The detail was unsettling, too realistic. Another pirate held a branding iron, pressing it into the chest of a man tied to a post. Smoke curled from the wound, and the man's face was etched with agony. "Is this new?" Derek asked, his voice trembling. "No," Kayla whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't part of the ride." We floated further, the boat moving slower now, almost reluctantly. More scenes unfolded, each worse than the last. A pirate dragged a lifeless body across the cobblestone floor, leaving a slick trail of blood behind him. Another leaned over a wooden barrel filled with water, holding a struggling prisoner's head under the surface. The prisoner's hands twitched, and bubbles rose to the surface before popping with an eerie stillness. And then there was the cage. It hung from the ceiling, swaying gently as though something inside was still moving. A skeletal figure was crumpled within, its bony hands clutching the bars. But as we passed, the head snapped toward us. Its hollow eyes stared directly into mine. I froze, unable to speak, unable to look away. "Did that just move?" Lisa stammered, clutching my arm. The others didn't answer. We were too distracted by the sounds. At first they were faint, low groans, muffled cries, the crack of a whip echoing through the cavernous space. But as we moved deeper, they grew louder, more vivid. "They wouldn't put this in a kid's ride," Kayla said, her voice trembling. "This isn't Disney." She was right. Everything about this was wrong. The animatronics, if that's what they were, moved too smoothly, their expressions too lifelike. The air grew colder, the smell of decay overpowering, and then the boat stopped. We were in the center of a large chamber, dimly lit by torches. In the middle of the room was a massive table surrounded by pirates. But they weren't drinking or feasting like in the usual scenes. They were carving. A lifelike figure lay on the table, screaming silently as the pirates tore into him with knives and hooks. Blood pooled beneath him, dripping into the water around our boat. The animatronics turned to look at us as we floated by. One of them smiled. Lisa started sobbing. Derek gripped the side of the boat so hard his knuckles turned white. "Make it stop," Kayla whispered, over and over. "Make it stop." I wanted to scream, but my throat felt frozen. All I could do was stare as the boat began to move again, heading toward another tunnel. The darkness closed in, and the whispers started. At first, they were faint, not just like the groans and screams from earlier, but they grew louder, overlapping until they surrounded us. "Turn back. Leave this place. You'll never escape." The air felt heavy, crushing, and the smell of rot was unbearable. I thought I saw shadows darting along the walls, figures moving just out of sight. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We floated into the loading area, back in the normal part of the ride. The cheerful music was playing again, the lights bright and warm. Cast members were helping guests off other boats, smiling and chatting like nothing was wrong. When our boat stopped, one of the cast members greeted us. "Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the ride." We stumbled out, too shaken to respond. My hands were wet, and when I looked down, I saw dark streaks on my jeans and shirt. They smelled like salt water and something else. Something foul. "What is this?" Lisa whispered, staring at the stains on her own clothes. We tried to tell the cast members what had happened, but they just laughed. "That scene doesn't exist," they said. "You must have imagined it. But I know what we saw. And when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the whispers. You'll never escape." Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed these Disneyland horror stories. If you did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. I'll be posting twice a week with more haunting content. Hit the bell icon so you're always the first to know when a new story drops. Your support helps so much, so thank you, and I'll see you in the shadows.